So today's daf is daf dalid. Because of the layout of the page, we're going to start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the top of dalid Amud Aleph with the words gufa. Gufa, we go back to something that was mentioned on daf Gimel, which was as follows. Ba'e Rav Bevai bar Abaye. Rav Bevai, the son of Abaye, asked the following question. Hidbik pat batanur. If a person put bread to bake in the oven on Shabbat, so the question is this: a person, let's say, you could use any example, but the example is chosen for a reason. One is removing bread from an oven was considered an art. It was something that you had to really know how to do, and it was not allowed on Shabbat. Even if you baked bread in advance and you left it in the oven, you weren't supposed to remove the bread from the oven, because the way that they stuck it to the oven, it was a whole technique that you had to do.
They did it the way the Indians, the Pakistanis do it. Slap the dough
on the wall, right? So you weren't allowed to remove bread from the oven on Shabbat. So the question was, what if somebody put dough in the oven and then they said, you know what, I just realized I put it in on Shabbat, and if it bakes, I'm going to be liable for Chilul Shabbat. I'm going to have cooked on Shabbat. I want to take it out now. So what happens? He goes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, can I take the bread out before it bakes so I don't violate Shabbat? Because I didn't get to the point of baking yet. So that was the question. Do we allow him to violate a small prohibition of removing the bread, which is just a rabbinical prohibition, in order to avoid actually violating Shabbat? That's the question. So, Amar le Rav Acha bar Abaye. Rav Acha bar Abaye said to Ravina, Hechi dameh. What case was I guess it's his brother, okay? What was he talking about? Because ilema bishogeg velo idkar le leman hitiru. We can't be talking about a case where he put the bread in the oven and he forgot about it. It was by accident, and he must have realized it at some point, right? Because if he didn't realize it, then he couldn't have asked the question. Correct? Okay, so it must be where he realized it. Ve'elalav de'iyadar ve'idkar. So it must be that he accidentally put it in, and then he realized. So mi mechayev, would in such a case would one really be liable for violating Shabbat? Vatnan, we learned in the Mishnah, kol chayev chataot אינם חייבים עד שיטי תחילתן שגגה וסופן שגגה אלא במזיד קודם שיבוא לידי איסור סקילה מבעילי. So what they say is like this, that if you did something, but you initiated a process by accident, and in the middle you realized what you had done before it was completed, that's not bishogeg anymore. So let's say the person accidentally put dough in the oven, not realizing it was Shabbat, and then he realizes it's in there. Actually, it's not bishogeg anymore, because now he knows about it. It's not considered accidental anymore. He's aware of it. So that means that if the bread were to bake, he would not be liable, obviously, for the death penalty, because when he did it by accident. And he wouldn't be liable to bring a korban, because he actually realized what he was doing before his action was culminated.
The premise doesn't make sense.
So it has to be shgaga from beginning to end. It has to be completely a lapse of awareness, lapse of awareness.
How is it that if you do something without knowing and it's done, and then you become aware that you've done something afterwards, that it becomes bemezid?
It doesn't become bemezid. It's just saying it's not bishogeg. It's not considered. Shgaga means that you completed the action in a state of being unaware. Okay?
Right.
So the whole action, the whole process. So in order to qualify for bringing a korban, you have to have been completely unaware of what you did, in one way or another. So what happens here is it's not that it becomes mezid now because you realized what you were doing. It's just it doesn't qualify for shogeg.
But anything, if you bring a korban, by the time you bring the korban, you're going to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
So is there like a time?
But the point was you had to have done the complete action and then realize that you did it by accident.
Right.
And then, so in this case, if the bread was just put in the oven, and he realizes midway that, oh my gosh, I put bread in the oven and it's Shabbat. I thought it was Yom Tov or something. Whatever. He made a mistake. So he realizes his mistake in the middle. So we can't say that the whole action took place under a mistaken or a lack of awareness, and therefore he wouldn't qualify for a korban chatat. That's the way the rules work. The rules work that you have to be completely unaware of what you did, and the action ended, and then you realized afterwards what you had done wrong. You realized the mistake afterwards. If you realize the mistake in the middle, but you can't stop it, it's not considered.
So in
that
other
you
words,
did
if
it
you put the bread and removed it,
Right.
And
then you realized,
and the whole time he didn't realize that
then
would be
Bishogeg.
That was Shabbat.
That's Bishogeg.
Okay, now I understand.
What's the status?
It has a status where you did something. I mean, I would say spiritually, you did something. It's still looked at as a chet bishogeg but you wouldn't have the recourse of bringing a korban, and certainly you wouldn't get the death penalty because you made a mistake when you started it.
But if you put the bread before Shabbat,
right,
but it's taking longer for the bread to finish.
So then you have this separate problem that you're not supposed to remove the bread on Shabbat. Okay, but that's a separate issue. That's rabbinic, right? Yeah. So therefore he says Ela b'mezid. It must mean that he put the dough in knowing it was Shabbat, and then he had remorse. He felt bad. He's like, I really shouldn't do this. I want to take it out now. The rabbi said, no, sorry. You're not allowed to remove bread from the oven on Shabbat. Now you can die, man. That's it. It's amazing, right? That's what it sounds like, right? So what?
Same as yesterday's stuff where the arm is stretched out.
Stretches out. You have to hold it there all Shabbat. Yeah. So what does Tosafot say here? He says something very interesting. He says, what happens? If they, so Tosafot asked the question, I mean, what kind of question is this? Because if they didn't allow him to take it out, let's say he was warned, he goes to put the dough in, and Edim, witnesses come, and they say, if you put that in there, you're going to be liable for the death penalty for violating Shabbat. And he says, I don't care, I'm going to put it in anyway. He puts it in, and then he says, oh my gosh, what an idiot I am, I need to take it out. Because if it actually bakes, I'm going to be baked. Or not exactly, actually it gets kila, but I'm going to be stoned, but not in the way that people like to be. So what does he do? So Tosafot says, he's not going to listen to you if you tell him he's not allowed to take the bread out, is he? Right? Because his life is at stake. He would be crazy to listen to you. He's not going to listen. So he says, rather, what does it mean? He says that if you're not allowed to take the bread out, that would actually exempt you from punishment. Because it's honest. I wanted to take it out, but I can't take it out. So if the person put it in b'mezid, but then had remorse, and the rabbi didn't let him take it out, that would actually exempt him from punishment because he had no choice. He couldn't take it out. He wanted to and he couldn't. He was stopped from doing it. If he's allowed to and he leaves it in, then it's his responsibility that he left it in there.
But shouldn't you violate their balance and not violate their rights?
That's kind of what the question is. That's kind of what the question is. To what extent we're flexible like that in this case?
The rabbi is saying don't violate any of them.
Right. He's saying don't violate any of them.
Once you're there, you have their right to. Then you should.
Well, it's not always so simple. It's not always so simple.
Choice between one, the other, or none.
Right, or none. Right. So what does he say? So he says, Amar Rav Shel. So therefore, what's the question really? The real question is, when it's b'mezid, can you take out the bread? That's the question. So Amar Rav Shela says le'olam b'shogeg. Actually, it could even be in a case of shogeg, where you put in the dough. We said it has to be a case where you put the dough in on purpose. Because if you put it in by accident and he realizes in the middle, it's not by accident anymore, and he's going to be exempt anyway from bringing a korban. So it must mean when he did it on purpose, and by doing it on purpose, he's making himself subject to a serious punishment, and now he wants to take it out. But Rav Shela says no, we can even say that it's talking about shogeg. Who did they allow? Other people. In other words, you went and put the dough in by accident, and now your friend comes over and says, hey, Bob just put dough in the oven by accident. He doesn't realize it's Shabbat. Can I take it out before it bakes so he doesn't have the korban chatat on his head that he violated Shabbat? It was an accident. He doesn't realize it. So that's the question. So matzkif la Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet says, "V'chiyomim la l'adam chateh kedei sheyizkeh chaverecha." Do we say to one person, do a sin so your other person can benefit? In other words, we don't say to a person, oh, you violate a rabbinic prohibition, so he doesn't violate this. It doesn't work like that. We might say to you, violate the rabbinic prohibition to save yourself from a more serious prohibition. But we're not going to say to some other guy, take out the bread from the oven so that the other person doesn't violate something by accident anyway. It's anyway b'shogeg. Okay, so we don't say that. So Elam Rav Asher says, Leolam b'mezid. We're talking about mezid. He did it on purpose. And the question is whether if he has remorse after putting the dough in the oven and he doesn't want to give up his life for the sake of a loaf of bread, literally. So therefore, he can. The question was, can he remove it? And in fact, we don't need all this theory because it was stated explicitly, as we're going to see. Ravacha berei de Rava matnei la behedya. In Rav Acha, the son of Rava's version of this dispute, it was stated explicitly. Amar Rav Bevai bar Abaye. The question was, Hidbik patanor hitiru lo lirdota kodem shiavo lide isur sekila. That it was actually a statement that Rav Bevai, the son of Abaye, said, if a person puts the dough into the oven on Shabbat on purpose, the rabbis allow him to take it out, which, as Tosafot mentions, is both a positive and a negative. It's a positive because the person can redeem themselves midway and change the course of the situation. However, it's also a negative in a way because it puts the onus or the responsibility of the situation on the doer. So he can't come back and say, "Oh, I wanted to take the dough out. I felt really bad, but I couldn't because the rabbis told me it's not allowed." He can't blame it on the rabbis. So he's fully responsible if the dough ends up baking. So now we say Pashata Aniyat Yado. So we go back to the case of the Mishnah, where the poor person sticks his hand out and either deposits something in the private domain, or he takes something and deposits it in the public domain. Does this sound familiar? Okay, good. So.
Well, this example was given in the context of that. This was given an example to explain
about holding the arm.
About holding the arm.
Right, holding the arm. Right. That's how we got onto it. But in the Mishnah, we have two cases where the poor person standing outside either puts something in or takes something out, and we have a case where the person standing inside either puts something out or brings something in, and then we have a case where they are partners and they do it together, where between the two of them they either bring something in the house or take something out. So the Mishnah, Amai Chayav, why in this case is he liable? Okay, because v'habainan akira v'hanacham me'al gabe makom daled al daled veleka. There's a general principle that in order to be considered a real hanacha, that the object is resting, it has to be resting on a place of 4x4 tefachim. Okay, which means to say that anything that you pick up, remember, in Hotza'ah, in Masekhet Hotza'ah, when we're talking about carrying on Shabbat, the full melacha is you picked up an object in one domain, you transferred it to the other domain, and you set it down. You need those three pieces. Akira is picking up, Hanacha is putting down, and then you have Ha'avara, which is transfer.
So a hand wouldn't qualify as that.
So that's the problem. Right. So a hand shouldn't work. Exactly. Even he might not.
Something on my hand
I don't know how big his hands were. He was just really tall. I assume so. So an average person is not going to have a hand that's 4x4 tefachim. And the halacha is that in order for an object to be considered at rest, it needs 4x4 tefachim, which means it has to be picked up from a place which is 4x4 tefachim, and it has to be put down on a place which is 4x4 tefachim. Which is why one of the tricks that they tell you to do, if you realize you're carrying something in a place you can't, is find a place that's less than 4x4 tefachim and put it down on that. Because then it's not considered really that you're... Why? Because it's not secure. It's considered not secure. It's not considered resting.
How much is it?
This. Yeah. So
that works whether it's Mereshut Rabim Lereshut Hayachid or Mereshut Rabim.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. So the problem is the hand taking out of somebody's hand or putting it into a hand is never going to be considered a picking up or a putting down, because the hand is not 4x4 tefachim. So how does that work? So ditnan, as we said. So I'm sorry. So Amar Rabba said Hamani Rabbi Akiva. This Mishnah must follow Rabbi Akiva. Because he says you don't need for something to rest in a place of 4x4 tefachim. Ditnan, as we said in the Mishnah, hazorek me reshut hayachid reshut hayachid or reshut harabim be'emtza. Rabbi Akiva mechayev v'chachamim poterin. That there was a case. What if you throw from there were two buildings across the street from each other. You throw from building A to building B. It goes through the public domain. Normally the malacha is from a private domain to a public domain, or a public domain to a private domain. Here you threw from a private domain to a private domain. So the akira was in a private domain. The hanacha was in a private domain. Okay, not public. A different private domain, but still not public. It passed through a public area. So what do you see? That just, according to Rabbi Akiva, just the fact that it's passing through the public area, it's as if it were resting in the public area.
Was it Rashi or Tosfot that says the transfer is the problem?
Oh, what we talked about earlier?
Yeah, the transfer.
It seems like Tosfot thinks that the transfer is more essential. I mean, they're all part of the problem, but the transfer is more essential according to him. Yeah. So So Rabbi Akiva here, though, holds that even though it passed through the airspace of a Reshut HaRabim, which clearly it means it did not rest on a spot of 4x4 tefachim, and yet it's considered to have rested there, and you're considered to have transferred into the public domain. So Rabbi Akiva savar amrinan kiluta kimishu hunchad damya, that something that passes through the airspace of is as if it were resting in that space. And the Chachamim, and we say that the rabbis say that passing through airspace is not considered resting in that space. Okay, that's the machloket. But clearly Rabbi Akiva is not requiring a resting on a 4x4 tefach space because it's going through the air. Unless there was something floating in the air that rested on along the way. But that would be using our imagination and very creatively. Okay, so the memra, the pshita le rabba, the vekluta kemishun chadamya. And then we turn to Amud Bet. Toch asara peligei. Is it indeed clear that this is the basis of the argument between the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva? That Rabbi Akiva is saying that passing through airspace is considered resting, and that the rabbis are saying it isn't. Toch asara peligei. And we're talking about within 10 tvachim of the ground. Okay, is that clearly the case? That is what our case is here. Vahami baya ba'ela Rabba. But Rabba asked what was the machloket. He didn't know what the explanation was. He asked. De ba'e Rabba lematam yud pligei ubaha pligei de Rabbi Akiva savar kaluta kimishun chadamya v'Rabbanan savrei lo amrinan kaluta kimishun chadamya. Aval lemala me'asara divrei kol patur. Okay? Udukulei alma lo yalfinan zorek mimoshet. In other words, there were two different ways of interpreting the machloket here. One was that Rabbi Akiva says that something that passes through airspace, as long as it's within 10 tefachim of the ground, if it passes through airspace, then that is considered to be resting, as long as it's within 10 tefachim of the ground.
Well, we covered that already.
Okay? Right. This is the first version, right? But above 10 tefachim is called makom patur. It's considered an exempt area. It's not an area that objects are usually put down. So passing through that area is considered insignificant. So even if it were to rest, let's say 10 tefachim in the air, it caught onto something in midair, 10 tefachim in the air, in the Reshut HaRabim, it wouldn't be considered at rest. Okay, it's above the Reshut HaRabim, the functional Reshut HaRabim. So everybody agrees apparently. Okay, according to the first version, within 10 tefachim of the ground, Rabbi Akiva says anything that passes through that airspace, it's as if it were on the ground. And the rabbis say not. But above 10 tefachim, everyone would seem to agree that it's patur. If you threw so high through the Reshut HaRabim that it was over 10 tefachim, and it landed in another private domain, that would be good, according to everybody. Velo yalfinan zorek mimoshit, which what that means is moshit, passing something from a private domain to another private domain with a public domain in the middle was one of the melachot that was done in the Mishkan. But it was above 10 tefachim, specifically. So throwing from one to the other above 10 tefachim doesn't count. But passing does count, because that's how it was done in the Mishkan. Very interesting. So that would mean that we don't apply that rule of above 10 tefachim. That's only something for passing, not for throwing. So that was one version of understanding the machloket. The other version was like this. O dilma lemala miyod pligei, upa pligei, Rabbi Akiva savar yalfin zorek mimoshit, v'Rabbanan savar lo yalfin zorek mimoshit, aval lemata miyod divrei kol chayav, mai ta'ama amrin kluta kimishun chadamya. But there's another way you can interpret the machloket between the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva, that everybody agrees that if you're within 10 tefachim of the ground, it's considered resting. Above 10 tefachim is where there's a machloket. That Rabbi Akiva says we compare throwing to passing. And just like passing from one private domain to another with a Reshut HaRabim in the middle is a malacha, even though it's above 10 tefachim, so too with throwing. And the rabbis say no, that's only for passing, because that's how it was done in the Mishkan, but for throwing it doesn't count. That's one way of learning the machloket. So how come Rabbah now is so sure that the rabbis say that something that passes within 10 tefachim of the ground is not considered resting, when we see here that he was toying with both possibilities? It could be that the rabbis agree with Rabbi Akiva about that, and they're arguing about a higher case where it's up in the air even higher. Or it could be that they're actually arguing about whether something that passes through airspace within 10 tefachim is considered at the ground. That's the question. So, what's the answer? Halokashya batar di ibae hadar ifshitale. Not everybody who has a problem stays with it forever, my friends. People solve problems. He had a difficulty, and he eventually resolved it in favor of the conclusion that Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis are arguing about under 10 tefachim. And that the rabbis are saying that something that passes through the airspace is not considered resting. He concluded that was it. The Savar Rabbi Akiva, Kluta Kamishun Chadamya, that Rabbi Akiva is the one that says that something that travels through airspace is considered resting in that space, even though it's in motion. So it's like Zeno's paradox a little bit, where motion is impossible because, in order to move one step, you have to move half a step. In order to move half a step, you have to move a quarter of a step, and therefore you can never move.
Okay.
So the idea is that since you look at it as second by second, you can sort of, in a hypothetical way, view it as resting in that space. Yes?
Okay, I have a quick question.
Exactly. Calculus.
Confusion, because didn't we study...
That goes back to your analysis of the light, particles and waves,
Didn't we cover before that when you put something in somebody's hand and it's above 10 tefachim, that's not considered. There was the comparison to 4.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to more of that. It's not the discussion's not over yet.
I thought we that wasn't something that
it's going to come back though.
Oh, it's going to come back.
No.
Because I thought that nobody
situation not resolved yet.
About
not resolved yet. Wait and see. Yeah, not resolved yet. Okay, so it's going to come back around. So there's a lot of discussion to be had. So, but v'dilma hanachahu delo ba'aya ha'akira ba'aya. But maybe even according to Rabbi Akiva, it's true that to be considered resting, in other words, when you threw from the private domain to the public domain and it landed in the private domain, that's actually two different things. Because you moved something from the private domain to the public domain and then from the public to the other private. Okay? So which one is Rabbi Akiva saying you're in trouble for? It could be that he says that when you threw it from the private domain into the public domain and it passed through that airspace, it was considered resting there. But he's not going to say that you then uprooted it from the public domain and put it in the private domain again. He's not going to give you credit, so to speak, or hold you accountable for two violations. What? No, meaning in theory, because all of this is one action. You threw it from private to private with public in the middle. So the question is, when he says mechayev, maybe he just means that from moving it from private to public, that first action, you did it, because it's considered like it's resting. But he's not going to say, and you also moved it from the public to the other private domain. He's not going to extend it that far. He's not going to say that it says if you also picked it up out of the public domain and put it in the private domain. He's just saying you picked it up from the private domain, you threw it through the public domain, and that throwing through the public domain is as if you made it rest in the public domain. Okay? That's what they're suggesting now. In which case, it wouldn't totally solve our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is holding, would seem to be holding, that something which comes in and out of a hand is considered to be, the rule that it has to be from 4x4 tefachim that we've been applying so far, okay, that we're supposed to have, it has to rest on a place of 4x4 tefachim. So we're saying that we're not going to apply that because we're following Rabbi Akiva. But maybe Rabbi Akiva only dispenses with that idea when it comes to putting the object to rest. But he might still agree that when you pick it up to start the process, it has to be from a 4x4 tefachim area. And therefore our Mishnah would not be explained, because there are still cases where you're taking something out of a hand and not out, right, and chayav. So that's the problem. So, Ella Amarav Yosef Hamani Rabbi. This is actually Rabbi, not Rabbi Akiva. Hi Rabbi, which case, where are you getting this from Rabbi? Ha Rabbi, maybe you'll say this one. Maybe you're trying to bring a proof from a case in a Braita where it says if you threw an object and it landed on a ziz kol shehu, a little tiny protrusion from a wall or whatever, a little tiny spot, that according to Rabbi, if it landed, mechayev. It doesn't matter that it didn't land on something that was 4x4 tefachim. The rabbis say no, that it's not considered to be at rest. But that's not what that case is talking about there. Because Abaye explained because that's talking about somebody that's talking about a very specific case where you are standing in the Reshut HaRabim. And there's a tree in the Reshut HaYachid, in the private domain, in somebody's backyard, and its branches are hanging into the Reshut HaRabim. That happens all the time. Look right across the street. Okay? There are branches from somebody's fenced-in yard hanging into the public domain. If you throw from the public domain and it lands on one of those branches, even if it's 4x4 tefachim or whatever, what did you just throw onto? Did you throw onto something did it land in the private domain or the public domain? Well, it's kind of still in the public domain because that branch is hanging over, but on the other hand, that branch is an extension of something in the private domain. So there's a machloket here. So according to the Rabbi, we look at it as you just transferred it to the private domain. Because the tree is in the private domain. According to the Chachamim, no, it's in the public domain. The Rabbi Savar, Ikaro, because he says, look at the branch as if it goes after Ikaro, the trunk. Wherever the trunk is, where the branch is. But the rabbis are going to say, no, we don't say that. We look at where the branch is. Where's the branch? It's in the public domain, right? So that's where your object landed. So therefore we can't learn anything from Rabbi there, because he wasn't talking about a case necessarily where the object landed on an area of less than 4 by 4 tefachim. It could be that it was. The main point there was that it was a branch that was protruding from another domain. So what case are you referring to? Elahad Rabbi. Must be this one. This is exactly the converse of what we had before. Before we had 2 private domains with a public domain in the middle, and you threw from one private domain to one private domain, and it passed through the public domain. Okay? Now we have the opposite. There's 2 public domains, and there's a house in the middle. You threw a ball, you're playing baseball, and you threw the ball and went right through the guy's window, through the other side of the window, and it landed on the outside. Hopefully that's never happened to you.
Play for the Yankees.
Yeah, now you play for the Nationals. Yeah, so you have to be, actually maybe you have to be good for that. Rabbi Mechayev, the Chachamim Potrin, Rabbi says, Mechayev, that even though it didn't rest in the private domain, it's still considered to have rested because it passed through the airspace of the private domain. Okay, so Mechayev, he's going to say you transferred from the private domain to the public domain. Or the other way around, from the public to the private. Because you started in public, you threw the ball, it went through the private, and went from the private into the public again. The Chachamim say no, that because it didn't come to rest in that private domain, it's not considered to be it's not going to be considered to have rested anywhere, and therefore all you did was move something from one place to another in the public domain. Amar Rav Yehuda said, Amar Shmuel, because so you should have asked me a question. Wait a second, but how is that different than what we said about Rabbi Akiva before? Because he had the same case, and you said that wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough because that only proved that it was considered to rest in the middle, not that it was considered to be picked up again. In other words, that only proves something about putting down, not about picking up.
No, Rabbi Akiva talked about the 4 by 4 tefachim.
Because they were saying he clearly doesn't hold you need 4 by 4 tefachim for putting down, because when you threw from the private domain to the other private domain, it passed through the public domain, but you only violated one thing, which was moving from private to public, even though it didn't rest in the public. But we don't know that picking it up from a place that's less than 4 by 4 tefachim counts. So you say, what's the same thing here? No, because Amar Rav Yehuda Shmuel, Mechayev haya Rabbi Shetayim. Achat mishum hotza'ah, ve'achat mishum achnasa. That's the difference. In other words, the rabbis here in this machloket, not only did Rabbi say that by throwing it through that private domain, you violated one thing. It's actually 2. Because what did you do? You picked it up in the public domain, you transferred it to the private domain, and by your same koach, you picked it up out of the private domain, and you put it in the public domain again. So you did 2 melachot. And we say that even though the object never rested in the private domain, so therefore you can't say that you picked it up off of a 4 by 4 area, a 4 by 4 tefachim area. Certainly not, because it never actually physically rested. And yet Rabbi says that it's both considered to have rested in the private domain and to have been picked up and put out of the private domain, all through that one action.
So let's say you were Superman, and what
do you mean, let's say?
Throw it, yeah. And you throw it and it goes through. Private domain, public domain, private domain, public domain, private.
Right, yeah, you can do many averot according to Rabbi.
5, 6, 7 averot.
It's a good thing he's not Jewish. Superman.
But what about the issue of 10 tefachim high? That the rabbis held that as long as it passed over something that was 10 tefachim high, that it didn't count.
We're talking everything on the lower now. We're talking about the not
below.
Ground level. Like within a few feet of the ground.
We all agree that if it passes.
What do you mean when a pitcher throws, he doesn't throw higher than 10 tefachim? It's 10 tefachim is.
How is 10 tefachim?
That's 3 feet. Well, no, 10 tefachim is, what is it?
4 inches.
It's about 40 inches. Yeah, it's like 3.5 feet.
So he does
throw
above 10 tefachim.
Right.
He does.
A pitcher? No.
Yeah.
A strike zone is not 4 feet off the ground.
I guess you're right.
No way. Yeah. So anyway, so if it is, I don't know what team you're pitching on. Maybe if you're walking the guy, intentional walk, it might be. In any case, so what do we see? So we see that both resting and picking up are considered to happen, even though the object never actually stopped. So therefore we can take Rabbi and say he's the author of our Mishnah, because in our Mishnah we see that putting something into somebody's hand or picking it up out of somebody's hand is considered valid, even though obviously nobody's hand that we know is 4x4 tefachim. Okay, so itmar Allah. But no, we reject this as well, because we said about this already that Rav Shmuel Damrei Tarvayu, as we turn to Hey Amud Aleph, that they said, both of them, that Lo Mechayev Rabbi Ella Birshut HaYachid Mikora, that Rabbi only applied this to a private domain that is roofed. It has a roof. Why? Damrinan Beta Keman Demalya Damya. Aval she'ena mikora lo. So what do you see? That when something passes through a private domain that has a roof, the whole place is considered like it's full of object. In other words, it's considered like a solid. So true, it didn't come to rest physically anywhere, but anything that passes through a private domain, it's considered to be resting and having been picked up. But that's a unique case.
Would be fine.
That's a unique case. It's a unique case of a private domain that has a roof. In other words, a house, when it passes through, it's considered to have stopped in the house, even though it's considered like the house is full, like it's a solid entity.
But how about if you throw something and it lands into a pool?
That depends where the pool is. It's too complicated. Yeah. And maybe you'll say, Bimkora, that we're talking also about in our Mishnah. We're talking about a Reshut HaRabim that has a roof. How that would be, I don't know, but I guess so. This principle that a private domain that has a roof is considered like a solid, that only applies to a private domain. Okay, but not a public domain. V'hamar Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Hamavir Chefetz Dalad Amot B'Reshut HaRabim Mikora Patur, Lefi she'eno domeh lediglei midbar. That they said, Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said, that Rabbi Abba said, that Rav Huna said, that Rav said, that if you carry something, one of the malachot, in addition to transferring from a private domain to a public domain, and from a public domain to a private domain, also carrying something for amot in a public domain is a malacha. So he says that if you were to carry in a roofed public domain, let's say, for example, there's a roof over, I don't know, if they were ever to construct a roof, well, not the sort of, it's hard to say. Let's a shuk that has a roof, whatever. Okay, but it couldn't have walls, because once it has walls, it's not going to be a deoraita, a private domain anymore. But let's say some a shuk that has a roof over it, so it's not considered mideoraita, minatorah. It's not considered a public domain because it's not domela diglei midbar. It's not like the way that they encamped in the wilderness. The encampment of the wilderness is our ultimate example of a public domain. And while the Ashkenazim take that a little bit too far, perhaps, and require 600,000 people to pass through every day in order to call it a public domain, we don't necessarily go that far. But at least in the physical structure, our approach is a little bit different. We don't look at the number of people that pass through, but from the perspective of physical structure, if it has a roof, that definitely makes it something unique, and it would not be considered a Reshut HaRabim anymore. So we can't use that to try to explain our Mishnah. And in the next daf, it will go through several different explanations. I wish we had time to get all the way to the final conclusion. But basically, to foreshadow, since I believe we're going to miss it, I think we're going to miss this in the daf, what they're going to come up with is that there's a special principle that Yado Shel Adam Chashuva Lo Kedaled Al Daled, that the hand of a person, because of its significance, is considered like a 4x4 area. Because it's part of a bigger, because it's part of him, because it's part of the person. Right. So for a person, because that's how you control things. Because why is it that we require this 4x4 area? Because of stability. That when something is at rest, it's really at rest. But nobody's going to think nothing is better for holding than your own hand. So certainly that's going to be counted at least as good as a 4x4 area, and that's the way the Gemara is going to conclude in the end. Have a great day.